But neumes have a fatal flaw. They give you the outline of the melody you're singing, but they don't tell you where you're starting from, nor how the different tunes relate to each other. Neumes are a bit like a map, which has the shape of the roads on it, but none of the road names or numbers. A map without north, south, east or west. Pretty unhelpful, really. Unless, of course, you already know the tune you're singing and you just want to jog your memory. That's what neumes are best at. Reminding you of a tune you already know, not showing it to you for the first time. The inadequacy of neumes was a problem for all the abbeys and cathedrals of Europe. Then, out of northern Italy, came the Big Bang, an idea that turned the humble neumes into agents of dynamic change. And this was that big idea, a thin red line. The red line acted as a fixed reference pitch for the notes to lock onto. Now you knew where your tune started and where it ended, simply by looking at where the notes were in relation to the red line. This is a hymn to St. Cecilia, the patron saint of music. And what you're looking at in this 900-year-old manuscript is the moment frozen in time where Western music took its first great leap forward. A thin red line. We don't know who thought of it first, but we do know who saw its significance and potential and put it on the musical map. His name was Guido Monaco, and legend has it he may have ended his days in this monastery of Fonte Avellana in northern Italy. Now, a modest red line may not seem all that remarkable at first glance, but it is nonetheless music's equivalent of the printing press or sliced bread. It's therefore about time we found out a bit more about the geezer who was responsible for it, Guido D'Arezzo. History hasn't left us too many clues about Guido Monaco, Guido the monk, except that his reputation as an innovative singing teacher led to his being headhunted by the Bishop of Arezzo. Guido came here to work in about 1020. Thanks to his revolutionary methods, his fame spread across Christian Europe. The fact that Guido, the man who gave us musical notation, is hardly a household name can hardly be blamed on Arezzo, the handsome Tuscan university town where he lived and worked for many years. Despite the fact Arezzo has quite a few famous sons to celebrate, the poet Petrarch, the Renaissance biographer Vasari, and the artist Piero della Francesca, to name but three, they haven't forgotten their lone musical genius. Indeed, in the late 19th century, in a burst of civic pride, they rediscovered him in a big way. Alas, much of the 19th century Guidoniana doesn't bear much historical scrutiny. This house, for example, proclaims proudly that Guido was born and worked here. One of the few things about his life that scholars can now say for certain is that neither statement is in fact true. One thing we can be sure of is that Guido came here, because this ruin of foundations is all that's left of the cathedral he worked in the 1020s. They built another cathedral a century later on the opposite hill. This building was demolished in the 16th century by Cosimo de' Medici to show the people of Arezzo how jolly macho he was. It was in this building that Guido set up a choir school, soon to become famous throughout Italy. Broadly speaking, his methods are still in use today. Guido's choristers, who sang here in this very building every day, were the first people ever to read music at sight from the page. That someone could sing a tune they'd never heard before simply by looking at squiggles and dots on paper was considered one of the great marvels of the time. Guido wrote two medieval blockbusters on the teaching of singing. The most influential, Micrologus, he wrote here in Arezzo. In them, he demonstrated his new lined method of notation that made the reading of notes utterly simple and clear. His biggest idea was the washing line principle. He drew one straight red horizontal line, like that. And he called this F. He said this would always represent the note F. So he put an F at the front of it like that. Now, nowadays, we'd call that a clef, French word for key, and Guido invented it. So, a blob on the line meant sing the note F, la. And a blob above the line meant sing the next note up, la, G. And a blob below the line meant sing the note below, E, la. Now, I know this seems fantastically simple to us, but then so does the wheel, and it took mankind a long time to figure that out. Eventually, he added another line in fetching yellow above it, which represented the note C, and a third line between the two, which represented the note A. And the spaces between them were G and B. So you had F, G, A, B, C. And here are those lines copied out in a copy of his book, Micrologus. And all you had to do was follow the blobs on the washing line, grazie Roberto, and you could read the notes one after another, easy as pie. La da dee la 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 dee 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 dee. Written notation was the theory, and a darn good one too, but Guido as a singing teacher wanted to help his choristers in practice. He wanted his pupils to be able to hear in their heads the relative pitch of notes, to develop an instinct for how high or low a given note, A, B, D, G, would be. You see, to sing a tune properly, you have to be able to recognise instantly the distance between two notes. For example, when we sing, "Should all acquaintance be forgot," that first leap, "should all," we know is 4 notes, not 5, "should all," or for that matter, 7, "should all." Now those leaps are called intervals, and Guido had a novel way of remembering them. Here's a clue.
Doe, a deer, a female deer, ray, a drop of golden sun. Me, a name I call myself, far, a long, long way to run.
It was Guido who invented the do-re-mi singing scale we all so enjoyed in The Sound of Music. It's still in use today as a means of teaching children to sing, just as it was nearly 1,000 years ago when Guido first came up with it.
A deer, a female deer, ray, a drop of golden sun.
To pick up some more clues about this remarkable, elusive figure and to see his do-re-mi singing scale in action, I visited the small hillside village of Talla, 30 kilometres from Arezzo, where, legend has it, Guido was born. A veritable Guido shrine has been lovingly created, high above the town.
Thank you. Grazie.
The vice-mayor, the curator of the museum, the policeman and the town clerk took me up to see their exquisite Guido museum. Talla may not have much scholastic hard evidence for its claim on Guido, but its welcome for the Guido tourist is second to none. Gosh, this is the museum?
Yes, welcome to our little museum.
Thank you. Oh, what's this display here? The museum, though small, isn't short of state-of-the-art lighting wizardry.
In the Middle Age, violin,
Yeah.
you have the guitar, you have the...
Right. Yeah, and the tambourine?
The tambourine.
All
yes,
the parts of the
tambourine,
orchestra.
yes, of course.
Aha! And here is Guido's singing system in handy kit form against the wall. Like Maria in The Sound of Music, Guido taught his choristers a little ditty that he'd made up. His song, Ut queant laxis, wasn't quite as catchy as hers, and his choristers didn't wear lederhosen either, But never mind, the idea was the same. Now, the names ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la are the first syllables of each of the Latin phrases of this memorable hymn. Guido's system was actually called ut, re, mi, not do, re, mi, by the way. But that's another story. I think you'll agree that the phrase ut, a deer, a female deer, doesn't have quite the same ring to it. Now, each of the phrases begins with a different note, and the notes are arranged in a neat ladder from bottom to top, low to high. Ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, and tea, a drink with jam and bread, was added later, in case you're wondering. If I press this handy knob here, a group of monks, forever trapped behind this wall, will sing the whole phrase in Latin. In order to help his singers with the new ut, re, mi system, he even devised a trick whereby each of the notches on the fingers of your hand represented a different note of the scale. It was called the Guidonian hand, a bit like having a pocket calculator with you at all times. In fact, Guido didn't know which of his three techniques, lines notation, ut, re, mi, or the curious finger device, would be the most useful. But gradually, all over Christian Europe, it was his four-lined stave that became universally adopted. By the 12th century, all chant books looked pretty much like this one, with the standard 4 lines, so that anyone, anywhere, with the right training and a bit of gumption could read the tune. The 5th line, that we're familiar with, by the way, was added for other sorts of music in the 14th century. What Guido was trying to do was cut down the learning of the Gregorian chant from 10 years to 1. He himself had been a chorister. Indeed, the people of Talla suggest that he might have begun his life in the church as a young lad in this 10th century settlement, the Badia di Santa Trinita, hidden away deep in the Pratomagno woods high above the town. This is what Guido himself wrote. Therefore, I have decided, with God's help, to write this book in such a way that any intelligent and studious person may learn the chant by means of it. Should anyone doubt that I am telling the truth, let him come to learn and see that small boys can do this under our direction, boys who until now have been beaten for their gross ignorance of the Psalms. Guido's methods certainly revolutionized the teaching of singing, but what he could never have foreseen was that his new lined notation would have one other dramatic effect on the course of Western music, making it truly a big bang. Because it could now be written down, a much more sophisticated variety of music could exist that didn't rely on one person's memory. In other words, Guido paved the way for the emergence of a new, distinct species of musician, composers. Before the advent of notation, European music, like all the others in the world, was basically an improvised form in the hands of skilled performers. After Guido, the responsibility shifted dramatically from the performer to the new breed of specialist composer. Anonymous church musicians had already started experimenting with a primitive form of harmony. But the ability to see the notes laid out graphically on the page vastly accelerated the growth of a technique whereby one combined two voice lines together, two simultaneous tunes, that is, or counterpoint. It took composers about another 200 years to pluck up the courage to write 3 lines together. Another 150 years later, they could manage 4 parts, which became something of a standard for the next few centuries. Of course, adventurous composers mixed and matched the parts, so you could have a bit of solo, a bit of 2-part, a bit of 3-part, a bit of 4-part, and so on, all in one piece. Works of great beauty followed. One of them, Allegri's Miserere, was thought by the Pope to be too powerful and spiritually disturbing for ordinary mortals, and he decreed that it should only be performed once a year by his own choir. Making a copy of the piece would be punished by excommunication, and the masters were kept under lock and key in the Vatican. However, the Pope had not reckoned with the ability of a 14-year-old boy to hear the piece once, then return to his lodgings and write the entire thing out from memory. It lasts, by the way, about 15 minutes. He then smuggled the illegal copy of the music out of Rome and thereby cheekily broke the official embargo. The young man in question was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. No notation, no Mozart. No Mozart, no Miserere. Here is the choir of Christ Church Cathedral, Oxford, and an extract from Allegri's Miserere Mei. composers were able to create music that couldn't possibly have been conceived just through spontaneous playing. What's more, they were able to construct forms and shapes for long pieces that were way, way beyond the capabilities of a normal person's short-term memory. Perhaps architecture is the best analogy. With the right materials and a bit of DIY nous, I can make a workman's shed without any kind of plan or drawing. But there's no way I could build the cathedral next to it without the benefit of an architect's drawings, without a graphic and detailed plan. A piece of musical architecture needs every bit as intricate a drawn-up plan as Salisbury Cathedral must once have had. From the birth of Homo sapiens to the time of William the Conqueror, music basically consisted of a tune with rhythmic accompaniment. But from Guido's invention onwards, the speed of change and the development of music has been, by comparison, dizzyingly fast. I don't think he realised quite what a genie he was letting out of his lamp, giving music a grid to work on and thereby making billions of harmonic combinations possible. As the centuries rolled by, music scores became more and more complex and sophisticated. More and more refinements were added to the thin red line so that an encyclopedic musical language developed. By the early 20th century, Stravinsky was stretching the orchestral score to its limit by asking for multiple layers not just of melody, but simultaneous layered rhythms too. By the end of the 20th century, Western notation's grip on all the world's music seemed unstoppable. Guido had made available the world's most effective composing tool. Within 100 or so years of his system's publication, we see for the first time the actual names of composers attached to music. For better or worse, music began to belong to certain people. Before, it had been a shared common currency, an endlessly recycled and repackaged commodity. Now it could become a permanent record, a one-off, a work of art. Music could transcend the moment, the person, the country, or the language, and be transported all by itself to another person in another country in another time and place, and still be that same piece of music. We can only guess what music sounded like to the ears of the Pharaoh Ramesses II or Antony and Cleopatra, but we can actually hold in our hands the music written during the reign of Richard the Lionheart or Napoleon Bonaparte, thanks to Guido. No other culture has ever managed to develop a notation like the Western model, even the otherwise musically sophisticated Chinese. The Chinese did have tablature, but tablature only tells you where to place your fingers on a stringed instrument. It hardly tells you anything about the actual music.